As soon as I recognized what the puzzle was that I was interested in solving, of course you have to come up with then steps to try and solve that puzzle. And so the first thing I wanted to do was document the trends and say, all right, so where were Democrats 30 years ago? Where were Republicans? And then how have they changed? And is it the fact that individual members are changing, or is it the fact that member A is retiring and then member B is elected and they just happen to be more ideological than the people that they replaced? And so I needed to get kind of at the instrumental building block level to try and understand what was going on district by district, Congress by Congress, state by state, to understand why it is that the Democrats were becoming more liberal and the Republicans were becoming more conservative. And then once we have those building blocks established, it was necessary to reflect upon the data and to see if I could come up with any more systematic explanations. Is what's happening in California the same as it's happening in New York? Is what's happening in the 1970s the same thing that's happened in the 1980s? And so I was trying to come up with systematic trends or explanations that could explain not only what was happening 30 years ago, but also 20 years ago and 10 years ago and even last week. And so it was in reflecting upon the data that I tried to come up with systematic explanations for what has happened over the arc of the last 40 years in politics in the House and the Senate. Right. The first step is that there's no doubt that members from the 1970s were replaced by more ideological members in the 1980s, and it was certainly happening in the South with the Southern Democrats who were being replaced by more conservative Republicans, but you also have the same type of trends happening in the North. So I knew that it couldn't just be a regional explanation or even just a constituency explanation, because what we also see is that the representative from Wyoming is much more conservative today than the representative from Wyoming was 30 years ago. And the same is true also in Delaware and Hawaii, which has 2 members of Congress. That we're seeing when even district lines don't change, and even when the constituency doesn't change, we get a different type of member. And so that led me to wondering, well, is there something happening inside the Capitol, inside the House of Representatives, inside the Senate, that might be causing the parties to become more ideological over time? And so then I started examining the procedures that were taking place both inside the House and inside the Senate. And what we find is that the procedures that are being implemented by the majority party in the House and between the parties in the Senate are becoming much more consequential. The number of amendments that can be offered is being severely restricted. The kinds of rules that are being implemented are much more carefully crafted so that certain members can't offer particular amendments. And so that led me to start evaluating and questioning if maybe the change in procedures wasn't leading the parties to look like they were being more extreme than they actually were. And sure enough, when we start looking at the procedures are both more consequential and they're much more divisive. So we see Democrats and Republicans, no doubt, disagree on major substantive issues, everything from the minimum wage to the budget deficit to taxes to engaging in wars in other countries. But they're even more at each other's throat when it comes down to the procedures by which they're going to be deciding those issues. And we see much more divergence we see much more homogeneity within party and much more heterogeneity between the parties.